This is a Munich Helles lager, and it's probably one of the best examples of the style that I've ever made. I'm excited to share this one with you guys. Let's jump in. When I made my fest beer for this year, I used the Augustiner strain of yeast for the first time, and I really enjoyed the result of it. It left the beer very well attenuated, yet still full of flavor, and specifically really pushed that malt flavor forward in a nice way. And I'm thinking that is exactly what I want out of a Munich Helles. The last time I brewed a Helles lager was a pretty long time ago, and when I did, I used the Nova Lager strain of yeast, which was fantastic. It was a great option for a warmer fermentation, but there's just a part of me that wants to use that authentic Munich lager strain, such as Augustiner, and so that's what we're going to be doing today. Helles lagers are one of my favorite styles of beer overall. They're simple German pale lagers. They're not German pilsners. They're not very hoppy. The balance is struck perfectly between maltiness and hops, and they're only about 4 to 5.5% alcohol overall. They're very sessionable beers. Unlike in my fest beer brew, I am going to be taking a few shortcuts here to make this beer brewing process a bit faster. Number one, I'm going to be using some enzymes to reduce the diacetyl contribution in the beer, eliminating the need for a diacetyl rest. And secondly, I'm going to be adding finings to clarify my beer faster. We'll talk more about those contributions later during the relevant sections of this video, but for awareness, I just wanted to put that out there right now. Before we jump into the recipe, I would like to give a quick shout out to Clawhammer Supply, who manufacture the system that I'll be brewing this beer with today. It is their 10-gallon, 240-volt electric brewing system. The grist in this one is very simple. Only 3 ingredients are going into this beer, and we're shooting for about a 1048 OG on this one, so about 10.25 pounds of overall fermentables are going in. We are starting with 8 pounds of high-quality German Pilsner malt, specifically Weyermann Pilsner malt. Following that, we're going to add 2 pounds of Best Malt's Best Vienna malt. Vienna malt is going to add a little bit of color and also a tiny bit of a toasty character, which is going to help accentuate the maltiness of this beer in a good way without making the beer too dark. And lastly, I'm going to add 4 ounces of Weyermann Carahel, which is a very pale crystal malt from Weyermann. I did this for my fest beer, and it actually really turned out very nice. This is not the same thing as Carapils or Carafoam, not even slightly close to that. It's a very different flavor, which I think is going to add a little bit of a honey sweetness to the beer while still being balanced out by the hops. Speaking of the hops, it's quite simple here, 22 IBUs overall. We're gonna start out with a clean bittering addition of 19 IBUs of Magnum. This is gonna be about half an ounce for me, and that'll be at 60 minutes. We're gonna boil for the whole hour, and then at 10 minutes, we are going to add 1 ounce of Tettnang, which is going to give us about 3 IBUs, and it's just a nice, spicy, herbal, classic German noble hop. I typically use Hallertau Mittelfrüh as my finishing hop at the 10-minute mark for most of my German lagers. I think it's been a long time since I actually used Tettnang instead, so I'm kind of curious to see what this does. For the water profile in this beer, I'm going to be using a very similar water profile to my fest beer, with an addition of a little extra sulfate relative to the chloride. This is going to cause the hops to pop out a little bit, be a little bit brighter, but it's also going to, more importantly, change the mouthfeel of this beer and make it crisp. One of the most important aspects in creating a crisp feeling lager is having a relatively high sulfate to chloride ratio. So that water profile is going to be 64 parts per million of calcium. This is also going to help the yeast drop out a little bit faster and clarify the beer a bit faster. 3 parts per million of magnesium, 26 parts per million of sodium, 72 parts per million of chloride, and 123 parts per million of sulfate. That gives us that almost 2-to-1 ratio of sulfate to chloride to really make that beer crisp. And 0 parts per million of bicarbonate. This is a no sparge brew day, so I am mashing in with all 8 gallons of brewing water at the same time. This is all reverse osmosis water, so I'll be adding the following water salts to all 8 gallons to get that water profile. 2 grams of calcium chloride, 2 grams of sodium chloride, 1 gram of Epsom, and 6 grams of gypsum. For the yeast in this beer, I'm using the Augustiner strain. The last time I used it, I used Omega OYL 114 Bayern Lager, and that's what I'm going to be using today. That being said, if you don't have access to that particular version of the Augustiner strain, it is also available as Imperial L17 Harvest and White Labs WLP 860. Even though this is a relatively low original gravity lager, all things considered, I'm still building up a starter with it for the purpose of having a healthy pitch. For the mash in this beer, I'm going to be using a typical two-step German Hochkirch style step mash. This is going to be 30 minutes at 148 degrees and 30 minutes at 158 degrees, followed by a 15-minute mash out at 170 degrees. This is what I will typically do for most of my German lagers and many of my other European beers as well. It just works. That being said, if you don't have the ability to do a step mash, there's nothing wrong with holding this one at about 152 degrees for 60 minutes. It will do the same thing and get you a very, very, very similar result. If you wish to add a little bit more authentic German character to this beer, I highly recommend doing a decoction mash. This is something that I've enjoyed doing many times for Czech lagers and sometimes for German lagers, although in my case, I don't really want to go through that effort right now. Of course, if you want to simulate a decoction, you can add a small amount of melanoidin malt into the grist and then do that step mash again. Should get you a very similar result as well. I'm actually tossing the melanoidin malt out entirely, and I'm kind of curious to find out if I enjoy that final result and if I still get kind of that kettle character in there. I doubt that I will, but it will be very interesting to find out regardless. Anyway, guys, I'm very excited to get this brew day going, so let's go ahead and jump into it. I started out by adding 8 gallons of reverse osmosis water into my 10-gallon 240-volt clawhammer supply system and started to heat that up to the first rest temperature of 148 degrees. As this was going on, I also milled out all of my grain and measured out my water salts and added those into the strike water as it was heating up. Once I met my target strike temperature, I doughed in with the entire grain bill, stirred it up thoroughly to ensure even distribution and no dough balls. Once 10 minutes had elapsed in the mash, I took a small sample for a pH measurement and cooled it down using some whiskey rocks. Thank you, Martin Keene, for that tip. And actually was able to get a on-target pH of 5.1, which is accurate considering there's no temperature differential. This was great as there was no pH adjustment required for the mash, so I let it continue for the rest of the designated schedule, which was half an hour at 148 degrees, half an hour at 158 degrees, and then 15 minutes at 170 for a mash out. Once the mash out was complete, I pulled out the grain basket and let that drain for another 15 minutes before firing up the kettle to a full-on boil. Once I hit the boil, I added in my 60-minute bittering addition, which was half an ounce of Magnum. I let that sit and boil for the next 50 minutes, and then 10 minutes before the end of the boil, I added in 1 ounce of Tettnang, as well as 1 Whirlfloc tablet and some yeast nutrient as well. Not very Reinheitsgebot of me, but still something that I like to do for these lagers. 10 minutes later, I ended the boil. I did a quick whirlpool to coagulate all the trub from the hops and proteins and get that all piled up into a nice cone in the center of the kettle before transferring through my counterflow chiller, chilling in the process, and collecting the cool down wort in my Brewbuilt X2. Once the transfer was complete, I used the glycol jacket on the Brewbuilt X2 to bring the temperature further down to about 50 degrees, where I pitched my starter of OYL 114 Bayern Lager. I took a sample for an original gravity measurement, found it to be exactly on target at 1048, and left it to ferment. I did attach a spunding valve set to atmospheric pressure at this time, so it basically just acts as an airlock, but a few days from the end of fermentation, I will crank that spunding valve down to about 0.6 bar, 10 psi, to get some natural carbonation in the beer as it finishes its fermentation. The fermentation for this beer is pretty straightforward. It is a lager, and therefore conventional wisdom would say ferment that nice and cold around 50 degrees Fahrenheit for however long it takes. And there's nothing wrong with doing it that way. That being said, though, this particular strain of yeast, along with another German lager yeast like W3470 from Weihenstephaner, gives you the option to ferment this actually quite a bit warmer than that, if you wish to, without any ill effects. Somehow this is still argued about amongst the brewing community, because tradition is tradition, and tradition is a very powerful thing, and tradition is a good thing in brewing. But there are sensory experiments myriad across the internet that have proven, I would say, that you can ferment your lagers up into the low 60s without any sort of issues whatsoever from a sensory perspective. I think in terms of a yeast strain, Weihenstephaner W3470 is the one that's most famous for being able to do this hot fermentation for the lager. That being said, L17 Harvest has done it many, many times as well. Being the same exact strain as OYL 114 that I'm using, I'm gonna go ahead and bring this up to about 60 degrees. I did my fest beer at 55 degrees with no added pressure, and it did fantastically. I'm gonna go at 60 degrees with this one, and then I'm going to spund the beer at the very end of the fermentation to capture some of that CO2 and self-carbonate the beer as well. Now, of course, you don't have to do this. You can go ahead and ferment this one nice and cold if you wish to, low and slow. It'll be just fine. You might get a little additional sulfur in there, but it will get the job done. At the same time, you can ferment this one hot and under pressure as well, and you can get a very similar result. If you're going full pressure fermentation the whole time, try to keep it under like 12 psi, because anything more than that can induce a little bit of sulfur character from stressed out yeast. With traditional lager fermentations also, you generally are going to be advised to give the beer a diacetyl rest. This is not a bad idea, bringing it up to a nice warm temperature at the very end of fermentation to get the diacetyl to be metabolized by the yeast so it doesn't show up in your beer later. Lately though, I've been getting into using ALDC enzyme in my fermentations. ALDC stands for acetolactate decarboxylase. But what it effectively does is it reduces the formation of diacetyl precursors. In fact, breaks them down into something else that you can't really taste. And so effectively, it prevents the yeast from forming diacetyl in quantity to exceed that flavor threshold right off the bat. And it's super useful because then you don't need the diacetyl rest, and you don't need any sort of additional fermentation time to clean things up that the yeast otherwise would have to metabolize. It's really, really handy. And of course, no, it's not Reinheitsgebot compliant. I don't really care. Neither are water salts, neither is Whirlfloc. Those don't really hurt the purity of the beer. Bottom line is, this is very, very helpful, and all it does is just slightly change the chemical processes that take place during fermentation. Traditional lager brewing would then have you start to slowly reduce the temperature on the beer until it is down to close to a freezing temperature over the course of several days, and then hold it at that lager temperature for several weeks until it is clear and crisp. I do not disagree that lagering time, that is cold storage time at very cold temperatures, is critical. When you take some time to let these beers sit cold, they change over time. Yes, they're tasty as a fresh beer, and there's nothing wrong with serving them young and early, especially if you like Keller beer styles, but the beer is truly different 4 or 5 weeks down the road after you've let it sit and be cold for that entire time. There is something magical that happens to it. It changes the mouthfeel, it changes the flavor characteristics, and it's really what makes it crispy at the end of the day. That being said, you don't need to leave it in the fermenter on the yeast the entire time. It's perfectly acceptable to transfer this into a keg and then lager it in the kegerator. That's exactly what I do. So what I'm gonna be doing is, once the beer is finished the fermentation and it has been spunded, it's got a little headspace in the fermentation, I'm gonna cold crash the beer then, and that'll drop out a lot of the sediment in the yeast already, and it'll allow some of that CO2 to absorb into the beer. Then I'm gonna take a keg, I'm gonna sanitize that keg, I'm going to add some gelatin to it and purge it with CO2, and then transfer the beer on top of that gelatin after it's been chilled. This is going to then drag a lot of the particulate material out of the beer. It's gonna clarify it within usually like 4 to 5 days, and it will be crisp and ready for the most part. I say for the most part because even with gelatin finance, I find that still is something magical that happens after that longer lagering period, even if the beer is clear. But I'd say it's like a 90% solution. In my opinion, it's perfectly acceptable to serve, but will continue to just get better and better as it sits in the back of your kegerator. These topics that I've discussed today, for some reason, are just always contentious in the homebrew community. It happens, it's never going away. But what I'm trying to say here is, this is my beer and I like to brew it the way I brew it, and I'm sharing that with you guys, right? I'm not saying this is the way you should brew it, and I'm certainly not saying that the old ways are the way you should brew it and there's no other room for doing things differently. Guys, it's 2024, it's not 1516. I guarantee you pretty much everyone watching this video is not a licensed German brewer, so there's a lot of freedom you could take here. Just brew your beer the way you want to brew it and have fun doing so. Don't be a jerk to other people based on how you like to make your beer. So just to recap, what I'll be doing is I'll be pitching in my OYL 114 Bayern Lager, and I'll be fermenting this at about 60 degrees Fahrenheit for probably about 10 to 14 days. As I see the beer continuing to ferment, about 4 to 5 gravity points from the very end of the fermentation, I'm going to spund this beer by attaching a spunding valve set to about 10 psi or about 0.6 bar, and that will get us a nicely carbonated beer at the end of the process. Once that beer has completed its fermentation fully, I will cold crash, and then I will transfer into a keg with some gelatin findings in it and start a short lagering process over the next few weeks. Once it's clarified, crispy, and tasty, it will be ready to serve, and I'm excited to share it with you guys then. So until then, cheers. Fermentation for this beer went very fast, but it was also very healthy. About 4 days in, I recorded a gravity of 1013, so at this point I decided it was time to start spunding, and so I cranked down the spunding valve to about 10 psi, or about 0.6 bar, to start capturing natural CO2 produced by the fermentation and self-carbonating the beer. And only 4 days after that, the beer was completely finished fermentation, getting us a final gravity of 1008, which was exactly in line with what I expected, especially from this yeast strain, nice and dry. I brought the temperature of the beer down to about 38 degrees, which allowed a lot of that yeast to drop out and get the beer slightly clarified prior to transfer to the keg, but it also allowed me to absorb all that CO2 pressure that was created during the spunding phase into the beer itself. And then I finally transferred over into my keg with a pressure transfer, keeping the carbonation in the beer. I did add a small amount of gelatin findings into the keg prior to transferring in. This just helps accelerate the rate at which things drop out of the beer prior to serving. Once the keg was in my kegerator, I left it at serving temperature, which is actually a convenient lagering temperature of 38 degrees, for another 2 weeks prior to serving it. I'm calling this beer Refinement, and it comes in at 5.2% alcohol and about 22 IBUs. For the appearance of the beer, it is a standard Helles. It is hitting all marks appearance-wise. It is pouring a beautiful golden color, perfectly clear, with a really, really nice construction of a white head that builds up nicely and sticks around for a while, leaves lacing on the glass, and is an absolute treat to look at. I do really enjoy with these pale lagers watching the bubbles kind of develop and bubble up through the beer. Definitely one of my favorite things. All right, so now let's go in for aroma. I do get a lot of maltiness out of this. I get that kind of classic hay-like Pilsner malt aroma. I'm getting some noble hop character as well, but not much. If anything, you get that kind of classic German aroma in there with just a nice amount of Pilsner malt character, a good clean noble hop character, no yeast character whatsoever. All right, so now let's go in for mouthfeel. Now, this is exactly what I was going for. It's clean, it's mostly crisp. I think it's getting there. It needs a little bit more time in lagering to really become the best it truly can be in terms of crispness, but it really does have some nice edges to it. The carbonation level on this one is also just right, I think. It's really quite nice. Not too high, but also definitely a little bit higher than your average ale. Makes me happy. The body of the beer is feeling medium to medium light. I think that's a good level for this one as well. Anything fuller than that would probably be a little too substantial for what this beer style is supposed to be. Now let's go in for flavor. Now that is a beer that I could drink bucket loads of. The bitterness aspect of it is there, and it's just that. It's a clean, nice, balanced bitterness, enough to give a little bite at the beginning, without being excessive. Certainly is not, the point of the beer is not a Pilsner style beer, so it doesn't have nearly that level of bittering to it, but enough to balance out the substantial package of malt flavor that comes right behind. You're getting loads of straw character, getting loads of honey-like sweetness with the Pilsner malt. You get that fine, just like super elegant Pilsner malt flavor. There is a nice depth of maltiness to this, so it goes from that kind of crackery, and honey-like sweetness. Then it goes into this really nice biscuity toastiness that comes, I think, from the Vienna malt. That level of Vienna malt was just enough such that it didn't change the color to something darker, and also that toastiness and that burniness contribution is not the main part of the flavor. It's not the most intense piece of it, but it certainly is a large enough part of it to be noticeable, and it adds depth to the beer. It adds richness and balance, and adds something that gives it much more to think about when you're drinking it, as opposed to just your base 100% Pilsner malt beer. I can definitely get some of the Caramel in here as well. It's a slight malty sweetness that I think is coming from more than just Vienna. It's a nice effect, makes me happy. It really accentuates some of the nicer aspects of this beer. The Augustiner yeast really shines in this one. Like I said at the beginning of the video, it does exactly what I said. It pushes that malt forward while still attenuating the beer nicely, which is just a fantastic effect in the final beer, making this extremely easy to drink. At the end of the day, though, I really do feel like this beer is probably the best interpretation of a Munich Helles that I have brewed to date. I'm very proud of this beer. It really did turn out pretty much exactly the way I wanted it to, and I'm really, really happy with it. That being said, though, there are still some things I think there could stand to be improved with this one from a recipe standpoint. Firstly, there is just a touch too much bitterness on this. I think it probably could stand to be dialed back. It's not out of style, it's just on the upper echelon of what is, you know, really an acceptable bitterness for the style. But that's a really pretty minor complaint, considering I feel like the bitterness on this is pretty balanced overall. I do like a more bitter beer though, so I'm a little biased when I say that. Secondly, I notably omitted the melanoidin malt, and I also chose not to do a decoction, very much so deliberately. And the resultant beer was quite good, and still, like I said, I think it's my finest Helles so far. But I do just feel like there would be a little bit more of something in there if I added maybe 1% melanoidin malt, or I did go through with that decoction. Decoction, in my opinion, always helps the beer. I've done it a million times in Czech lagers. I can tell you personally, and with a hell of a lot of bias, that I think it has an impact. But your mileage may vary, of course, depending on who you talk to. Melanoidin malt is really nice, but it is very intense and it can very quickly get out of control. So even for a pale beer like this, I think maybe 1% would be what I would add there. But otherwise, everything else I would keep the same. So there you have it. That's the final verdict on this one. I'm very happy with the final result. This will continue to only get better as it lagers and as it crisps up and turns into something truly amazing. But I highly encourage you to go ahead and try this one yourself. It may not be the perfect beer for the middle of winter like when I brewed it, but man, I wanted a Helles and I got a Helles. So I hope you guys enjoy it and brew one for yourselves. If you enjoyed this video and you learned something, please go ahead, hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Also, comment down below with your thoughts on the whole thing, your opinions, and any feedback you have for me. I really do appreciate it. If you want to support the channel, please consider picking up a t-shirt like this one. You can find this design and plenty of others linked in the merchandise store, which is down in the description box below the video. I also have a Patreon, and my patrons are really the reason why I can keep these videos flowing right now. It means a lot to me to have your support, and it's gone a very, very long way, from upgrading the production quality of this channel gradually over the last several years to just helping me to get cool and fun things to work with. It's everything from beer engines to spunding valves. Like, you guys are funding the whole thing, and I really appreciate all of that support. If Patreon is not your thing, though, please consider the channel memberships option as well as the super thanks button. Both of those are quick, easy, and I would say cheap ways to help support me, so please go ahead, check it out if you're curious. It all goes right back into the channel. I also have an Amazon store linked down below in the description box, where you can find all my channel production equipment, as well as all the homebrewing equipment that is available on Amazon that I have used and personally recommend. If it's there, great thing to check out for Christmas, as that's coming up very soon, and I think there's a lot of stuff on there that you might enjoy. I am also available on Instagram and Facebook as The Apartment Brewer, so check those links out for some more frequent content updates, where you'll see what's going to come to the channel in the very near and potentially very distant future as well. And then guys, if you're still here, if you're still watching at this point, thank you so much for watching the entire video. It means a ton to me, and it means that you're getting something out of these and that you're enjoying them, and that's really all I want out of it. It also helps a lot for the YouTube metrics, because if somebody watches the whole video, it tends to be pushed a little bit more to new viewers, and I personally appreciate that as well, considering this is what I do. Anyway, guys, this one goes out to you who are still watching at this point. Thank you very much, and I'll catch you all in the next one. So until then, Prost.